National emergency. There's rarely been a problem. They sign it. Nobody cares.
Soon after President Trump declares a national emergency for border wall funding, the list of challengers to Mr. Trump's announcement is rapidly growing.
Plus, taking a stand against sexual abuse, the Vatican dismisses ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick from the priesthood. We have a live report on this story from Rome.
Also, we'll go live to Nigeria, where people found their polls closed across the country after the country's electoral commission delays the presidential vote. We'll get the latest on what that's about.
We are live from CNN World Headquarters in Atlanta, and we want to welcome our viewers here in the United States and all around the world. I'm George Howell.
I'm Natalie Allen. Newsroom starts right now. And we begin at the White House. Declaring a national emergency is a big deal. So when the U.S. president made good on his threat to do that, to fund his wall, the lawyers and a lot of other people pounced.
And within hours of the president signing the document declaring this national emergency, the first lawsuit was filed. It was made by the government watchdog group Public Citizen.
Mr. Trump acknowledged he faces an uphill battle that might not succeed. Strangest of all, he may have sabotaged his own case by admitting he didn't really need to do this. We get more from CNN's Jim Acosta.
Trying to take a victory lap after a stinging defeat in Congress, President Trump declared a national emergency at the border to start tapping into administration funds to build his wall. But the president may have already undercut his case when he indicated his real motivation is to speed things along.
I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster. And I don't have to do it for the election. I've already done a lot of wall for the election, 2020.
Adding in more than $1 billion authorized by Congress, the White House said it secured a combined $8 billion for the wall. But the president was still selling the project, accusing critics of lying when it's pointed out that most illegal drugs coming into the U.S. go through legal ports of entry.
When you listen to politicians, in particular certain Democrats, they say it all comes through the port of entry. It's wrong. It's wrong. It's just a lie. It's all a lie.
But the president was once again hyping the threat at the border, making all sorts of unproven claims of his own.
Women and girls, you can't take them through ports of entry. You can't have them tied up in the back seat of a car or a truck or a van. They open the door. They look. They can't see three women with tape in their mouth or three women whose hands are tied.
And the president lashed out when the facts were presented to him. There's a lot of Department of Homeland Security data out there that shows border crossings at a near record low. That shows undocumented immigrants committing crime at lower levels.
You don't really believe that stat. Do you really believe that stat? Take a look at our federal prisons.
I believe in facts and statistics. Okay. The president sounded petulant, grumbling over the likelihood that Democrats will take him to court for circumventing Congress.
And we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there. And we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake, and we'll win in the Supreme Court.
Mr. Trump also appeared to mimic the president of China as he marveled over how the autocratic country punishes drug dealers.
I asked President Xi, I said, do you have a drug problem? No, no, no. I said, you have 1.4 billion people. What do you mean you have no drug problem? No, we don't have a drug problem. I said, why? Death penalty. We give death penalty to people that sell drugs. End of problem.
And the president bristled at the notion that conservative media stars are actually calling the shots when it comes to his policy.
Look, Sean Hannity has been a terrific, terrific supporter of what I do, not of me. If I changed my views, he wouldn't be with me. Rush Limbaugh, I think he's a great guy. Ann Coulter, I don't know her. I hardly know her.
But there are cracks in his wall of conservative support.
The only national emergency is that our president is an idiot.
The president all but stomped his feet when he was asked whether he is simply making up this national emergency. But the president has bigger things to worry about than which questions are asked at a news conference, such as the growing number of Republican senators who are raising concerns about the president's declaration, saying it may be unconstitutional. Jim Acosta, CNN, the White House.
But within hours of the president's declaration, congressional Democrats were demanding to know the legal basis for making such a claim.
The House Judiciary Committee has already fired off a letter demanding answers, and the House will look to block the president's legislation. Here's what two of those Democrats told CNN.
The Judiciary Committee is going to do an investigation of Donald Trump's authoritarian power grab. The framers of the Constitution are rolling in their graves right now because they specifically gave the power of their purse to the House of Representatives. There's no way they would allow the president to override that power by declaring this fake national emergency. We're going to interview these witnesses. We want to know what basis they have for this national emergency, what kind of communications they have. We want to request documents because we believe the president and his staff are acting in violation of the Constitution.
I am sure we will pass a resolution of disapproval in the House pursuant to the emergency statutes. That mandates under the emergency statute the Senate consider the emergency disapproval within 15 days without any ability to filibuster. I anticipate there'll be a majority vote in both houses to disapprove the resolution.
So again, I misspoke. I want to be very clear that the House will move to block the president with legislation. So we will see how that moves forward.
There are already about 650 miles, a little more than 1,000 kilometers of a physical barricade built between the U.S. and Mexico. That includes the Texas city of El Paso, an area the president has cited as justification for more border wall.
President Trump has argued that crime rates and illegal immigration have dramatically declined because of the border wall there, but critics tell a different story. Listen.
In 2008, that border wall demonstrably made us less, not more safe. El Paso, as you know, has always been, at least for the last 20 years, one of the safest cities in the United States of America. Before a wall it was, after a wall it was. So if the wall didn't make us safer, if it costs a lot of money to maintain, if it cuts us off from parts of our community, from our land, from our water supply, then it serves no real purpose and it should come down.
Joining me now is Cesar Blanco. He's a Democratic member of the Texas State House of Representatives, and he joins me via Skype from El Paso, Texas. Thanks so much for joining us, Mr. Blanco.
Great to be with you, Natalie.
Well, you represent and live in a border city. Is the president's declaration of an emergency at the border valid?
No, it is not. I am literally here in my home, which is about a couple of yards from the existing border wall, and we're one of the safest cities in the country. Most of the cities along the Texas-Mexico border are among the safest in the country, so the president's statement is false.
So where's it coming from? And what about the number of illegals trying to cross into El Paso? Do you not see that as a problem, as the president illustrates?
No, what the president has been stating is inaccurate. The numbers from U.S. Customs and Border Protection have indicated that migration has decreased throughout the years. And we really don't see that type of problem here. Most of the people that come across overstay their visas. So I think it's a symptom of a broken immigration system in the United States. I think that the border wall is something that this president has campaigned on and hasn't really been able to deliver. So now he's calling a national emergency because he needs to fund a wall for his base.
Well, he visited your city, El Paso, recently, and he has continued to talk, though, about dangerous people, criminals, he describes drug dealers coming across the border. In fact, he did that on Friday. Let's listen to what he said.
In El Paso, they have close to 2,000 murders right on the other side of the wall. And they had 23 murders. It's a lot of murders. But it's not close to 2,000 murders, right on the other side of the wall in Mexico. So everyone knows that walls work, and there are better examples than El Paso.
So how do you explain what he's talking about there?
Well, while there's violence on the other side in Mexico, there has been zero spillover violence in the United States. We continue to be one of the safest cities in the country, and I think he's using information from Mexico or the situation in Mexico to legitimize the necessity for a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. Look, I grew up here in El Paso, Texas. I have family in Juarez. Our community is a fluid community. We go back and forth and we visit each other. We go visit Juarez and have dinner or lunch and visit family members over there. And folks from Mexico come across legally. They shop, they dine here. We coexist as a community. We are two cities that are binational. We're right on the Mexico border, and we share the same community. But we don't have that type of violence on this side of the border in El Paso.
Right. Here are the statistics that we have. According to FBI crimes data and city law enforcement data analyzed by the newspaper, the El Paso Times, violent crime in the city peaked back in '93. Border fence construction was completed in 2009, but violent crime dropped long before the fence was built in El Paso, falling 34% between '93 and 2006. And then from 2006 to 2011, violent crime in the city went up again by 17%, but dropped again around the start of Operation Hold the Line, which stationed hundreds of Border Patrol agents along the border surrounding El Paso. So that's an illustration of what the situation is. Is that accurate? And what is working for El Paso?
Well, what's working are a combination of things. Our local law enforcement, meaning our sheriff's department, our police department, in coordination with federal law enforcement agents, meaning the U.S. Border Patrol as well as Customs and U.S. Customs. They all coordinate and they do a phenomenal job of protecting our communities. We also utilize technologies such as drones, cameras, sensors, and the like to continue to keep our communities safe. A wall is a medieval approach to a modern situation, and I think that we need to go beyond that and be smart about it. There are Republicans, one of them, Congressman Will Hurd, that I agree has the same ideas that I just laid out before you. So there are ways to secure this border and with new technologies that are smart. A medieval approach with a border wall is very expensive and just not very effective.
We appreciate your input there from El Paso State Representative Cesar Blanco. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, CNN has learned exclusively that the special counsel's team has interviewed the White House press secretary, Sarah Sanders. The subject of that interview, though, it is still not clear, but it could have something to do with how Sanders composed statements she made about the Russia investigation.
She told CNN, "The president urged me, like he has everyone in the administration, to fully cooperate with the special counsel. I was happy to voluntarily sit down with them, but that might not be completely accurate." A source says the White House did not immediately agree to let Mueller's team interview Sanders. Meantime, the special counsel's office says it now has evidence former Trump campaign advisor Roger Stone had direct communications with WikiLeaks.
Earlier, court filings had only outlined his attempts to communicate through intermediaries. Prosecutors say Stone wanted information about emails stolen by Russian hackers that could help Donald Trump's presidential campaign. And the special counsel's team says President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, you see here, deserves to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
69-year-old Manafort was convicted by a Virginia jury last year for bank and tax fraud and other crimes related to money he earned from Ukrainian politicians. For more about it, here's Evan Perez.
Paul Manafort could spend the rest of his life in prison if a judge follows sentencing guidelines endorsed by special counsel Robert Mueller's prosecutors. The guidelines call for between 19.5 and 24.5 years in prison. A federal jury in Alexandria, Virginia, convicted the former Trump campaign chairman guilty of financial crimes, including tax and bank fraud. Now, he's turning 70 years old this year. But prosecutors say he shouldn't get a break because of his age. They say that Manafort, quote, acted for more than a decade as if he were above the law. Manafort has separately pleaded guilty to federal charges here in Washington, but a judge has voided the plea agreement after ruling that Manafort lied to investigators and to the grand jury during the time that he was supposed to be cooperating. A newly released transcript from a hearing in D.C. federal court centers on the importance of Konstantin Kilimnik in Manafort's case. He was Manafort's business partner in Ukraine, and Special Counsel Robert Mueller says that Kilimnik is essentially a Russian spy. Manafort's lawyers have tried to push back against that, saying that Kilimnik also met with U.S. diplomats, suggesting that perhaps he was a double agent. But during a sealed court hearing a few days ago, the judge said it doesn't matter. She said that Manafort lied about his communications with Kilimnik, and the judge says that Kilimnik is the link between the Russians and the Trump campaign, which goes to the heart of Mueller's Russia investigation. Evan Paris, CNN, Washington.
U.S. Vice President Mike Pence takes to the world stage to speak to leaders at the Munich Security Conference. We'll take you there live to Germany just ahead.
Plus, the Vatican drums the disgraced American former cardinal out of the priesthood. The continuing fallout of the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal as CNN Newsroom continues.
This is CNN Breaking News.
A major development in the Catholic Church abuse scandal we're learning about. Former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, once a respected and influential religious leader in the United States, has now been kicked out of the priesthood.
A church trial found the disgraced former Archbishop of Washington guilty of sexually abusing minors. McCarrick had previously denied the accusations. The Vatican says the Pope's decision cannot be appealed. Let's get more now from CNN senior Vatican analyst John Allen, following the story for us live in Rome. And John, tell us more about McCarrick, his importance, and the significance of this latest move to kick him out of the priesthood.
Well, this is an extraordinarily significant move. It is, in fact, unprecedented. A cardinal has never been, the colloquial term for this is defrocked, that is, kicked out of the Catholic priesthood. And, of course, it is because of the accusations of sexual abuse, both of minors and adults, that have been lodged against former Cardinal McCarrick. Over the summer, Pope Francis accepted McCarrick's resignation as a cardinal, so he became an ex-cardinal. Today, he is an ex-priest. This is essentially the most significant penalty in church law that can be imposed upon a cleric. It's the Catholic equivalent of the death penalty. And clearly, the Vatican hopes that this will send a signal of resolve and seriousness about the clerical sex abuse scandals. We should note that this comes just a couple of days before a keenly anticipated summit of presidents of national bishops' conferences from all over the world is going to begin here in Rome, convened by Pope Francis to try to get on top of the clerical sexual abuse scandals, George.
You know, put this into context for us, if you would, John, because it does seem like it's one after another after another. Is this putting more pressure on the Pope and the Vatican to address this problem differently and more directly?
Yes, I absolutely think that's the case. And we should say that, you know, the Vatican wanted to have this verdict against McCarrick announced before that summit in order to sort of have it out of the way. The difficulty is that the McCarrick case is not out of the way yet, because the questions that most people have aren't just whether McCarrick himself was guilty, but who knew what he was up to, who covered up for him, who allowed him to remain at the peak of power in the Catholic Church for 20 years, despite persistent rumors that he was engaged in this kind of conduct. In other words, what the Catholic Church needs is accountability, not just for the crime of sexual abuse, but also for the cover-up. And I would suspect you're going to hear a lot of talk about that accountability question in the wake of today's decision. It will certainly be a part of the subtext for this high-profile summit of bishops that begins in Rome on Thursday. And until that piece of the puzzle falls into place, George, I don't think anybody is going to be prepared to say that the job has been done.
All right, but certainly this a big move by the Pope. John Allen, live for us in Rome. John, thank you.
A warehouse in Illinois was the scene of the latest tragic example of gun violence in the United States. Police say an employee there was being fired from his job when he went on a rampage at the facility. He killed 5 fellow workers and wounded 5 police officers and another employee.
Police say that he used a handgun in the 90-minute attack and was trying to hide when officers found him and killed him in a shootout. A bystander said the gunman was shooting, quote, everybody with a weapon that had a laser sight on it.
U.S. Vice President Mike Pence will take the stage soon in Germany. He's leading the U.S. delegation at the Munich Security Conference.
We continue to monitor events there in Munich. Leaders from all over the world, they're coming together to discuss the greatest threats to global peace. But this year, the United States is somewhat isolated for its approach to several foreign policy issues.
CNN's international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is covering the conference for us. He joins me now live from Germany. Hi to you, Nick. Well, what are the issues at the forefront of this year's meeting, and certainly what role the U.S. plays in international affairs under the Trump administration is likely to be broached by Mr. Pence when he speaks?
Well, I think very likely the audience will hear maybe what Mike Pence spoke about a couple of days ago in Warsaw, and that is that the United States really feels at odds at the moment, particularly with Britain, France and Germany, because of their creation of financial instruments to get around the sanctions that the United States has put on Iran. Now it's pulled out of that international nuclear deal. That's a point of tension. We heard from Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, earlier talking about the interconnectedness of things, essentially global warming and many other issues, the big issues that President Trump has opted out of on the global stage, wanting sort of more isolationism, more bilateral arrangements, rather than the sort of multinational global tools, institutions that have helped keep world peace and world order. So there are tensions there and differences, so we can expect shades of that. The U.S. delegation here, the biggest in years, and that has been noted by the audience here. Interestingly, when there was an introduction for that U.S. delegation earlier on, Nancy Pelosi, when her name was announced, there was a huge round of applause from the audience. So we get a sense perhaps where their sympathies lie, and not so much with President Trump's administration. Mike Pence arrived here just a few minutes ago, and his speech coming up. And as you say, people here are anticipating it, but we'll also be hearing from the Russian foreign minister around the same time as well. So, of course, maybe some interesting comments both ways there.
There's so many issues right now. The next summit with North Korea, troops pulling out of Syria, eventually the United States. Historically, though, Nick, how important is this conference?
You know, the trends that you hear discussed here at the Munich Security Conference tend to be the issues that come up over the next couple of years. And what's being discussed here, and I think everyone here seems to recognize that this is a moment of change. Not that the change is coming, but that it's happened. It's happening to the global order, a realignment of the global order, and perhaps a sense of a new Cold War, a multipolar new Cold War. China is seen really as in the ascendancy at the moment. The United States under President Trump seen as a disruption to the past global order at the moment. So all of that is a sense of change. But what you hear being spoken about a lot is about the technologies of the future, the game-changing battlefield technologies, whether we're talking about the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces agreement that looks like that will probably end this summer, across a number of issues, particularly artificial intelligence and how that will apply to the battlefield. So there's a huge amount of change coming. The global order, but the systems that will fight the coming wars.
Fascinating, and you'll be covering it for us, and we're about to hear from the U.S. Vice President Nick Robertson for us. Thank you, Nick.
It is interesting, though, if you think about global warming for sure, but AI, the pros and the cons around that's a big
unknown,
big issue for sure. Still ahead here on Newsroom. Mexico wouldn't pay for it, neither would the U.S. Congress, so President Trump found another way to do what he threatened to do all along. He declared a national emergency. We will fact-check the president's claims ahead for you.
We have tremendous amounts of drugs flowing into our country, much of it coming from the southern border. When you look and when you listen to politicians, in particular certain Democrats, they say it all comes through the port of entry. It's wrong. It's wrong. It's just a lie. It's all a lie. They say walls don't work. Walls work 100%.
U.S. President Trump has made good on his threat to declare a national emergency after Congress denied his demand for border wall funding. Now, lawsuits have already been filed to stop the president from diverting federal funds to build his wall, and congressional Democrats will bring up legislation to disavow his emergency declaration.
Now, whether or not the president overstepped his authority may ultimately rest with the U.S. Supreme Court. If Mr. Trump prevails, if he wins, he could access an additional $6.6 billion to fund the wall that he wants to build on the Mexican border. The president makes a lot of claims about the border wall and how it will protect, he says, the U.S. from crime, from illegal drugs, he says, and from illegal immigration.
But as our Tom Foreman reports, some of his claims don't seem to be very accurate.
One of the president's chief claims to his fans that always gets a lot of applause is the idea that the wall has already been started.
We're right now in construction with wall in some of the most important areas, and we have renovated a tremendous amount of wall, making it just as good as new. That's where a lot of the money has been spent on renovation.
The second part of that statement is true. There has been renovation, just as there has been under every president, and that's all there has been. There has been no new wall construction. This is a fact. There may be some started next month on a very tiny part of it, but for him to make that claim with the other one there makes this statement at very best misleading. Another big claim, El Paso had a giant crime problem. They built a wall and the crime was solved.
When the wall went up, was it better? You were there, some of you. It was not only better, it was like 100% better.
Yeah, go to El Paso. They do have a huge wall, a huge barrier down there. And yeah, they had a huge spike in violent crime. It went way up and it came way down. The problem is the wall was built down in this area and crime actually went up after it. All of that had nothing to do with the wall. It happened before the wall. That claim by the president is simply false. And one more he really likes to make is about how much drug traffic is coming in over that open land out there where there is no big barrier.
A big majority of the big drugs, the big drug loads, don't go through ports of entry. They can't go through ports of entry. You can't take big loads because you have people. We have some very capable people, the Border Patrol, law enforcement, looking.
We don't know what he means when he says big drugs, big loads. You mean monetary value, physical size? We have no idea. We do know this. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the very people he's citing there, say no, most of the drugs come through the official ports of entry. Look at heroin. What they said about heroin is the majority of the flow is through personally owned vehicles entering the United States at legal ports of entry, followed by tractor trailers. You need some proof? Look, here are the pictures that the DEA puts out showing some of those loads coming in here. In fact, the only type of drug that is coming in illegally that is more likely, according to the DEA, to come over open land where maybe a wall would slow them down or stop them is marijuana. So again, this claim by the president is false.
Let's talk more about this now with Natasha Lindstad. Natasha teaches government at the University of Essex in England, joining us this hour. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This whole debate, is this truly a national emergency? Is it not so much? Let's start with the president's own words. Listen closely to how he answers this question from reporter Peter Alexander with NBC News here in the States.
I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster.
I didn't need it, but I'd rather do it much faster. Keeping in mind, it took the president some 5 minutes to even get to the issue of the wall. He ticked through a number of other topics before he spoke about it. But in these few plain-spoken words, the president seemed to contradict his own emergency. We may be having some trouble.
I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if you had another clip for me. It's a political emergency for Trump. It's not a national security emergency. I mean, it's an emergency of his own making. There is nothing about this that would constitute a national emergency. National emergencies would need to be something that is extraordinary, a rare event where the threat is imminent, where it could have a geographic scope of affecting, all kinds of American citizens. And this doesn't even come close to passing that criteria. And he admitted it himself, which I was just sort of amazed by. He admitted that, I didn't even really need to do it. but I just needed to do it a little bit faster. So clearly this is really driven by his need to satisfy his base and to satisfy the right-wing media that was so critical of him when he had caved earlier regarding the shutdown. So he's making this a lot worse than he needed to.
Let's get a sense of what people are saying about this this most recent poll that gives a sense of people, answering the question, should Trump declare an emergency to build the wall? Well, you see 66%, Natasha, say no. 31% say yes. The majority of people in this poll deciding against this, keeping in mind the poll taken before the emergency was declared. But looking at this as a gamble, Natasha, where the president may or may not get what he wants, does this constitute a win for him in the eyes of his base that he tried? Or if it doesn't happen, if the wall doesn't get built, does that then work against him?
It does constitute a win for his base, but I mean, that's really the only win that's going to come from this. Because, I mean, as the poll revealed, 66% of the public does not want him to do this. They don't want him to build a wall by declaring a national emergency. And I think that, for the Republicans that are likely going to support him on this, because Senator Mitch McConnell has already said he's going to support Trump on this effort, they're not really looking at the long view. That what does this mean? For the next president? It could be a Democrat. And as Nancy Pelosi was tweeting throughout the day, this could have serious implications for future leaders, that they may decide to declare, gun control a national emergency, or the environment a national emergency. And so it could come back to bite them if they decide to push for this.
So now the rules allow for Congress to contest the president's move here. That challenge almost certainly to come from the House of Representatives, and it sets up an automatic vote in both chambers where Republicans will either have to stand by many of the statements made on record, Republicans calling this a bad idea, or, Natasha, we will watch the acrobatics of lawmakers contort themselves, their bodies, to fall back in line with the president. How do you see the Republican Party, responding if forced to a vote?
Well, there's only a handful of Republicans that have come out and been against this. And what it's looking like is that most of the Republicans, or at least enough to prevent a 2/3 majority from passing this, which would be needed in order to prevent Trump from vetoing it, most of the Republicans are going to go in line with what Mitch McConnell wants them to do. And, they may privately think very differently, that this is probably not a very good idea. This could really come back to hurt us later on. But they keep siding with Trump again and again and again. There have been so many instances where I thought that Republicans would decide, okay, enough is enough. There's been too many abuses of power that have taken place. But it looks like this is going to go through, and then it's probably going to end up in the courts.
Natasha Lindstad following this story with context and perspective. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Tens of millions of people in Nigeria went to vote, or were about to vote, and all of a sudden there's no election being held. Elections there have been postponed, and political parties are furious. So our citizens will have a live report from Nigeria about what's behind it.
Political parties are condemning election officials after they delayed the presidential elections by 1 week. It was a surprise to many people.
Right. Voters were supposed to head to the polls Saturday, but the elections were postponed at the last minute, leaving polling stations across the country empty.
The Electoral Commission says the delay was necessary to ensure fair elections. Voting will now be held on February 23rd. Following the story, our David McKenzie is live in Abuja. And David, look, you show up to vote, you think you're there to do it, and then all of a sudden you're told, hey, not this week. Still unclear for people, and many wondering when it will happen. Tell us about why this delay and what's the reaction to it there.
Well, the reaction is disappointment and frustration. Many people would have come to this polling stations like this. In fact, 7 polling stations were in this primary and secondary school. You see now just kids playing some soccer here, and there should have been hundreds of people lining up to vote. Some people even, George, slept overnight, traveled across the country to get to their home areas to be part of this crucial vote. More than 80 million people disappointment. A recent statement from the president, Muhammadu Buhari, says he's deeply disappointed. He's coming here to the capital. He said they were assured as he put it, hour by hour, day by day, that the Electoral Commission would be ready to go ahead with this vote. Right now, the country is mostly calm. There have been pockets of some tension, but there have been delays of votes in both 2011 and 2015. So, you know, some Nigerians will take this in their stride, though it's deeply inconvenient and certainly leads to worries about the legitimacy of this vote because of the uncertainty of the process. George?
David, keeping in mind, you know, we've seen no violence before, and so the concern about this question now, as far as this vote being delayed, are people very upset to hear this?
Well, certainly they are upset. They inconvenienced themselves. The streets were closed, the borders shut down. People were told that they had to come and vote, that it was a democratic right, and then that right is, if not taken away, certainly delayed. The opposition party is saying that they're asking people to keep calm, of course, and also starting to raise questions about the legitimacy of the Electoral Commission and its independence. The president, again, just recently assured the nation of its independence and said they need to carry out their work. So a huge amount of pressure on the Electoral Commission to get this right. They say that they had logistical challenges getting ballot boxes, ballots to the various polling stations. We spoke to some people this morning who were supposed to run this election on the local level. They said they had everything they needed, just not the ballots. They came to work, some of them sleeping overnight to put through this critical election, and then were told basically to go home and come back in a week's time. George?
It's left some people scratching their heads for sure. David McKenzie following the story live at Abuja. David, thank you.
We're going to take you to the snowy western United